Okay, Sam, welcome. So I'm here with Sam Tideman. I've been following his channel for a while. He's got a fantastic channel, covers a lot of different things, theology, church history. I've seen some recent talks with Viveki on AI, so really interesting stuff. I want to talk to Sam today because Sam is a biblical Unitarian. And so I think this is a really unique perspective. Most Christianity is, or could be described as Trinitarian, the idea that God is three persons, but still one God. Sam has a bit of a different perspective. So I'm going to talk to him about that and kind of ask him to explain what that actually means, and why he holds to that perspective. I'm also interested in having a discussion around what is divine, what is God, and what is non-divine, or maybe you would say natural versus the supernatural, or natural versus the divine. What is that distinction? Why is that distinction important? Um, so I'm hoping that this talk could be interesting not only to Christians or people interested in Christianity, but just people who are maybe interested in theology in general or philosophy in general. Um, but just to start us off, Sam, would you like to just explain, maybe in a nutshell, what is biblical Unitarianism?
Sure. I suppose there's like a couple different ways to answer that question. One would be historically, like, what is biblical Unitarianism? And in a certain sense, I guess historically, it starts in basically the Protestant Reformation, although we would point to early forms of Christianity that seem to have held similar beliefs. But it's not like a denomination. It's not like you can like just Google search, oh, the biblical Unitarian, church of whatever.
Mhm.
It's more a description of like a certain theological set of beliefs, like you might hear Calvinism or premillennialism or something where it's describing a certain kind of theology, but you could seemingly hold a lot of other beliefs in combination with it. So, and there might be multiple denominations that hold some variety of adherence to it or something like that. So it's more like that in terms of describing a particular theological belief as opposed to denomination. There are a handful of like actual, brick and mortar denominations that hold to it, but I would say more common than that would be that it's somewhat found kind of scattered throughout various individuals or home fellowships or disorganized churches. Sorry, disorganized, not organized together churches.
Mhm.
And it mostly happens when some person or teacher or something like that decides to kind of question the doctrine of the Trinity and then go back to the Bible and sort of reverse engineer from there what they think the proper relationship between God and Jesus is. And this is something that's happened multiple times. Like, I don't even know how many times throughout history. Like, I honestly think that it happens like hundreds or thousands of times a year in individual people all over the world. So it's like a little bit hard to exactly, it's a little herding cats to describe biblical Unitarianism. And then when you get someone who comes to this conclusion about the doctrine of the Trinity or the not doctrine of the Trinity, they might believe like a whole host of other things for every other doctrine under the sun. So when we try and like find each other and get together, it's like, oh man, you came to this conclusion too. Oh great. Oh wait a minute, what do you think about everything else? And then it's like hard to get people together. But anyway, so that's sort of like historically or sociologically what it is. It almost is always basically a Protestant thing of sort of a back to the Bible restorationist posture. But like I did say, there really are Christians that you can point to historically in the first couple centuries that seem to have held the same position. So what is this position? I mean, basically it's a Unitarian monotheistic conception of God that would be, say, similar to Judaism or Islam in terms of just believing God as a singular personal being. And then Jesus is born as a human being, almost always conceived of by the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary. and then that Jesus gets, dies, is resurrected, and then gets exalted to heaven as a human being, not as a member of the co-equal eternal Godhead or something like that. There are some Unitarians who would maybe believe in the pre-existence of Jesus, but he maybe pre-existed as like a secondary God or a demigod or a super angel or something like that. And us biblical Unitarians go back and forth on whether or not they're the same sort of thing that we are, or whether or not to share the label with them or something like that. But for the most part, when I use biblical Unitarianism, it's someone who thinks that Jesus is a human being who began to exist as a human being in the Virgin Mary and is now exalted into heaven. And the biblical part would be that you would believe in the inspiration of the Holy Scriptures in some way, that you would think that the New Testament, as commonly defined, is the Word of God. And that's to sort of separate us on the other end from like the liberal Unitarians, who people might be more aware of. Although once upon a time, the Unitarian Universalists were mostly biblical Unitarians too, and they went through kind of their own sort of liberalizing or progressivizing sort of process in their own denomination. But once upon a time, the main energy behind the denomination now known as Unitarian Universalism was similar to that back in sort of the 1800s. But anyway, that's sort of quickly what biblical Unitarianism is. And so when I'll be talking on behalf of biblical Unitarianism, it'll be hard for me because sometimes I know I can really, in some sense, only speak on behalf of myself. And the people that I know closest that might agree with me. Like almost everything that I say, because of this kind of ragtag nature of biblical Unitarianism, might not be fully representative of everyone who would accept that label.
So what I'm getting is it's a theological tendency. It's not a definite denomination, and it's limited, shall we say, to the doctrine, or well, let's say the doctrine of God, the doctrine that God is one, just simply one personal being, and that Jesus is like fully human, and only human, I should say. But that different biblical Unitarians might have different other doctrines as well. Is that fair to say? Nope. I think your audio
Yeah,
cut out.
that's exactly right.
Oh, I think it's just a lag. Let me stop doing my video. That might help the connection.
All right, can you hear me? Just testing.
Yep, I can hear you.
All right, yeah. So I would say, yeah, you're right that it's a theological tendency or classification, but not exactly a coherent movement.
So different biblical Unitarians might have different views potentially on salvation, and maybe you kind of alluded to maybe have different views on the virgin birth, things like that.
Right. And maybe like specifically, I suspect when we get into the topic that you mentioned earlier about the connection between the human and the divine, there are some biblical Unitarians who are perfectly happy saying that Jesus gets made divine and that he becomes sort of a divinized human. And there are some biblical Unitarians who sort of bristle at that language, honestly,
Okay.
and just want no Jesus to not be God in any sense whatsoever.
Yes.
Sometimes I feel like they're sort of overreacting to a Trinitarian definition of divine, but I know that not everyone feels that same way.
Yeah.
Documents describing biblical Unitarianism in like the 2nd century says, well, some of them seem to think that Jesus becomes God when he gets exalted into heaven, and some don't. So that division in biblical Unitarianism might go back about 1900 years.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I was thinking about, that we could touch on later, is just the notion of theosis or divinization and how that sort of plays, if at all, in biblical Unitarianism. But just sticking with sort of what it is, where does the Holy Spirit fit in all this? How do biblical Unitarians see the Holy Spirit?
Yeah, and again, there might be diversity, but I actually really almost everyone agrees with the general idea that the Holy Spirit is sort of a attribute or power of God the Father, and then not a co-equal person,
Mm-hmm.
and that it is God's Spirit And specifically, it's sort of a way that God interacts with the world, and perhaps even most specifically, that God interacts with human beings. And that it would be invisible and that you could personify it sometimes, but don't go too overboard and forget that you're personifying it, and that it is one of the attributes or activities of God the Father.
Okay, so basically, the Holy Spirit is God, but Christ is not God. That would be a
Right.
simple way to say it.
Right. Some people think that we think that the Holy Spirit's not divine. It's like, no, it's the opposite. We think the Holy Spirit's divine. It's just we don't think the Holy Spirit's a separate, distinct person.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Um, okay, well that I think that's a good sort of outline of the position. And I guess you would argue that it's fundamentally biblical. This is something that you're deriving from the scriptures. It's something that's in there. It's essentially, you would say, the original interpretation of Christianity.
Yeah, that is our argument, that this is what the New Testament itself teaches, and that this is the most historically plausibly accurate view that we can attribute to the earliest Christians who were reading the New Testament and writing the New Testament, and that the goal then should be to have the doctrine of God and the doctrine of Jesus that is most authentic to the apostles, and presumably what even Jesus himself believed about himself
Mm.
and taught.
Hmm.
And that this is sort of the objective, is to get back to that original understanding. I like my friend Jacob, who is Jewish, who is sympathetic with my theology but not himself Christian, will often say that Trinitarians sometimes seem to have this weird contradiction where they think that Jesus is God, but they think that he was not a particularly good teacher if earliest Christianity didn't come to understand the doctrine of the Trinity until a couple hundred years later. And so my doctrine is sort of the opposite, that Jesus was a good teacher and we have to figure out what it was that he was teaching.
Okay. Okay. So I guess one good reason to believe it is that it's faithful to the scriptures, if you believe that, if that's your interpretation. So let's say one reason to believe it is that this is what the Bible teaches. But I'm also interested above and beyond that, are there other benefits to a Unitarian biblical position as opposed to a Trinitarian position? So let's say for someone who maybe doesn't believe that every word of the scripture is true, or just maybe feels that philosophical arguments or even practical arguments, if there are any, in terms of like
Mm-hmm.
what effect does this have on people, maybe they find that more appealing. Do you have other reasons above and beyond biblical?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I often say that there's kind of four categories I think that are persuasive for biblical Unitarianism. One would be the biblical one, but leaving that as our covered. I think the other one, like I mentioned, is historical. Like this is something that I spend a lot of time with on my own YouTube channel, is just digging into the early history of Christianity, and that I think that you can see biblical Unitarianism clearly there in the earliest centuries, and that you can also see the process of how the Trinity emerged to become a but you can see how Trinitarianism emerges on the scene, and then even after that becomes the dominant theology of Christianity. And so, like, I would say 2 points in biblical Unitarianism's favor is that biblical Unitarianism is earlier. And also, I feel like when you really stare at the history of the fourth century and like the history of Christianity after Constantine, and how it is that the Trinity became sort of the sole orthodoxy of Christianity, that it's really kind of messy and ugly and politically heavy handed in a way that I don't think is very flattering of the conclusions that they come to. So I think that that's another argument that you could give. A third would be philosophical. I feel like Trinitarianism is always sort of having to explain and defend itself philosophically, and that I would say it's had a long time to do so, and it never seemingly has quite completed the task of giving a philosophically coherent explanation of itself. And there are really two philosophical problems with the Trinity. There's like, how can three persons be one God? Sort of the philosophical problem of Trinitarianism. And then there's a second problem of philosophy of the incarnation. How could God become man? Or how could Jesus have a fully divine nature and a fully human nature and unite that in one person? And that I feel like both of those areas have been philosophically challenging for Trinitarianism for a long time, and that there has really never been, I would say, a coherent explanation for either of those questions that answers all the questions and objections to it. So that would be one problem. Whereas I feel like Unitarianism just like doesn't have any of those philosophical problems. I feel like, how can God be one person? Almost no one ever comes at me with an objection to that. I feel like Islam and Judaism have also pretty well explained and defended themselves on that front too. And there's just no philosophical incoherencies of the incarnation for Biblical Unitarianism. Almost no one ever criticizes Biblical Unitarianism as being philosophically incoherent. And then the fourth, and this is maybe even more directly what you were sort of asking, is like, are there maybe even like some motivational or emotional, or you could say kind of practical reasons? And I think that the most inspiring thing that Biblical Unitarianism has to offer is the idea that Jesus really is a human being like us, and that we can really relate to him and understand him on a human level, and that he can understand us back on a human level. And that to think about what Jesus did as a human accomplishment, and to think of our own potential to be like Christ as something that is just easier to contemplate when he's not sort of on the other side of some sort of ontological divide from us. I think that that's extremely compelling, and that is probably something that Biblical Unitarianism has to offer that I think anyone could understand, is the idea that Jesus just really is like us, is, I think, at some level deeply compelling and interesting and inspiring. And so those are sort of the suite of arguments, maybe, and we could go into those in more detail. But historical, philosophical, and I don't know, maybe personal or emotional is all reasons that one might be interested in Biblical Unitarianism.
Yeah, that's very interesting, especially the last point about the practical reason. It seems like the Unitarian Jesus is a far more relatable figure. There's always something mysterious or transcendent about the Trinitarian Jesus, where it's like, well, yes, in a way, he's fully human, but, dot, 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 there's something else going
But
on.
don't just a human. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, exactly. But just for clarity, you said something to the effect of, Jesus did what he did as a human, but you wouldn't deny that he did it with divine grace, right? It's not like a sort of,
Yeah.
it's not like it was human will that did it or something like that.
Right. I think kind of the great mystery, I guess, that maybe Biblical Unitarianism has, or the amazing thing about Jesus, is that, was it his own human will that accomplished things? Yes, in a certain sense. I mean, he had a genuine human will, but his accomplishment was completely submitting his will to God's will.
Mm,
And that's what allows God to work through him in an unobstructed and perfectly cooperative sense. Is that, in a certain sense, Jesus's accomplishment is that everything he accomplished was God's accomplishment.
mm, mm-hmm,
That the amazing thing about Jesus's will is that everything that Jesus willed was God's will.
mm,
And that's sort of the weird upside down paradox of Jesus, is that he wasn't like this. It wasn't like he was some Nietzschean
mm,
Superman
mm-hmm,
who was just exerting his uber will
mm-hmm,
on the world like Alexander the Great or something like that. That the amazing thing about Jesus as well is he never sought his own benefit. He never sought his own selfish will, but that he used his will to submit himself to God perfectly.
mm,
And that is the fundamental beauty of Jesus, is that he did everything according to how God would will it to be done.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so that would be what we are able to relate to and imitate, essentially. It's not that Jesus is an example of flexing his own will and imposing his own will, but renouncing his own will effectively. And
Yes.
and we
Willfully renouncing his own
yes,
will.
willfully renouncing as well, which is something that we also can do. Um, I might circle back to that topic a bit later because it seems like it could have a connection with something else I'm going to talk about. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about just throw out some thoughts that I've had about, let's say, how to put it, mediation between God and humans, or the
Mhm.
the entity that bridges the divine and the human. Um, Personally, I mean, well, first of all, I don't exactly identify as a Christian myself, so I can't sort of speak for Christianity, but I would say I have an attraction to and an interest in Christianity. And to me, your position of biblical Unitarianism, it doesn't feel like there's a hard distinction between that and Trinitarianism. It seems that they bleed into each other. That's just um, my sense of it. Um, and I guess part of that is that you kind of preserve the position or uphold the position of Jesus as being a kind of the kind of preeminent human being. And would you, I don't know if you would use these terms, but would you almost say like a mediator between God and man, or
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of our favorite verses as biblical Unitarians is 1 Timothy 2:5. For there is one God and one mediator between God and humankind, the man Christ Jesus. We
Mm,
feel like that's sort of like a perfect synopsis of our Christology. And so, on the topic of how God is mediated between human beings. And well, first off, I will say, I mean, I don't view Trinitarianism as like evil or awful or anti-Christian or something like that. I'm perfectly happy to think of Trinitarians as fellow Christians who are just sort of mistaken and or confused
mhm.
about certain theological questions. And I don't feel a need to draw some razor sharp divide between me and them. I do feel like on many things we like perfectly agree. It's just on a couple things that the difference can become clear. And that I do think there are negative implications of Trinitarianism, and that every Christian would be better served by being a biblical Unitarian. But I don't think of them as heretics or enemies or something like that. More just confused brothers and sisters. So I agree that you're right that there are probably shades of agreement between us, and that sometimes it's a question, is it a matter of emphasis or really a distinction? But one thing that I do think is interesting on this question of is how does God mediate between men is that I would say that this is something that fundamentally changed because of Jesus. I think that you can see the story of the Bible as something like in original paradise, Adam and Eve had some sort of unmediated access to God, but it was sort of like a naive or innocent access to God that then leaves when because of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil incident. And one thing that's interesting is that after Adam and Eve are separated from the garden, there's an angel that's placed between them and the garden. And I view that as after humanity has this sinful fallen state. And I should also say, I don't hold to a literal view of Adam and Eve. I hold to maybe an allegorical or a metaphorical understanding of the early part of Genesis. So when I'm talking about Adam and Eve, I'm doing that at a symbolic or allegorical level. Um, but that there is this angelic mediation that is now required between humanity and God, mainly because God is like too holy for us to interact with directly. And it's sort of almost for our own sakes that we can't be near God, because for sinful imperfection to be near godly perfection in its full unveiled way would be destructive of humanity. So it's almost like this angelic mediation in the heavens is sort of a protection for our sakes from God's full glory. And that in the Old Testament, I would say that the Torah, the law, was given to human beings through an angelic mediation, and that when people have visions of God in the Old Testament, it's sort of angelically mediated, and when God interacts with people, it's angelically mediated, and that this is sort of something that is a kind of a we don't humans in the Old Testament didn't have full access to God. And not that the angels were doing a bad job or something like that, but it was sort of, seen through a glass darkly and all of those sorts of things. And that Jesus, in a unique way, changes the relationship between humanity and angels. And that especially the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament talks a lot about Jesus as having been exalted above the angels, and that Jesus, once he's perfected, he can be in the presence of God in a way that humankind hadn't been able to be before. And that Jesus, because he is perfectly righteous, because he has been resurrected in this divine body, you could say, the spiritual body, he can go into God's full presence and not be obliterated or destroyed by the glory of God. And because of Jesus's accomplishment, all of humanity through Jesus has closer access to God than we had before. And that this is also a foreshadow of what will happen when all the Christians are resurrected and given spiritual bodies, is that we will all have that closeness to God that Jesus does now. And that part of the goal for humanity that God always had is that we would in some ways supersede the angels. And that I think that you can imagine, sometimes I think that this is sort of Satan's main motivation, is that Satan wasn't like on board with this plan of humans eventually becoming more important than the angels. And that Satan is sort of like the angel who's fighting on behalf of the angels to keep the angels more important than the human. And that uh, that's sort of Satan's motivation, I guess, is that he's trying to keep humanity below the angels, and that's why he's sort of Jesus's natural enemy. Whereas the righteous angels understand that this is God's plan and God's will is for humankind to eventually not even need the angelic mediation and to have direct access to God himself. And so I think that this is part of the narrative that it's not like Trinitarianism can't really have that narrative, but it doesn't work quite as well, I would say, if Jesus is sort of a divine human or like a part of the Godhead. It doesn't make sense to me as much as how that story would change or how that relationship between God and man would change.
Mm.
And I'm perfectly happy trying to talk about angels in a way that isn't as obviously Christian and isn't as obviously theological. I'm interested in those conversations between John Vervaeke and Peugeot and other folks where they're trying to talk about angels in sort of a more, I don't know,
Mm.
a more naturalistic way. But and so I'm perfectly happy to try and reframe that story in a way that isn't as overtly Christian in its language. But I still feel like the most natural way to talk about it is in those obviously Christian terms. And so I think that that narrative of humanity being exalted and given its full real place makes more sense if Jesus just is sort of an ontological human like us, who is sort of the first fruits to be brought into that new relationship with God and is sort of our brother, so to speak, who brings all of his brothers and sisters along with him to have that new relationship with God that Jesus himself now has.
So how would that relate to let's say atonement? I mean, original sin. I mean, I think one interpretation that of what you're saying could be that it's kind of like a Jesus is the inspiration. Jesus reveals God to us, but he also inspires us to imitate him, and in that sense, we draw closer to God. Or would you go beyond that and say that Jesus affects some kind of um, I don't know, substitution or reconciliation or atonement for sin? How do you view that?
Yeah, I would. I'm sort of a both and on the atonement in that question. That I know that some Unitarians in the past, especially more liberal ones, have kind of fought to deny some sort of substitutionary kind of atonement, or really anything that makes Jesus's death seem somewhat, I don't know, magical or superstitious, I guess. But I like to lean into the magical or superstitious part of Jesus's death too. But at the same time, I also feel like Trinitarians sometimes have a hard time acknowledging that, yes, Jesus really was a moral exemplary
Mm,
in what he did, and that because Jesus seems less imitatable from a Trinitarian perspective, that there's a little bit of a downplaying of that we really are supposed to imitate Jesus. So I want to preserve sort of that kind of mystical atonement thing and
mm,
Jesus as a moral exemplar at the same time. And so I think that I do believe in a substitutionary atonement, that we really do get made righteous by Jesus's righteousness, and that Jesus really was dying as sort of a punishment for sin itself, and that there was sort of that kind of transaction sort of thing going on, or at least that is a acceptable and insightful kind of metaphor or allegory for what's going on. But I feel like another thing that biblical Unitarians can say about the atonement that is, again, hard for a Trinitarian to say, is that I would say that humankind, in a certain sense, was perfected in Jesus on the cross, and that when we believe in Jesus, we receive, in some sense, a down payment of Jesus's own human perfection.
mhm,
And I would connect this to verses in Hebrews that talk about how Jesus was made perfect through what he suffered. And another really important idea for me is I have a really pretty strong distinction between old creation and new creation, and that there is this sense in which new creation, God's, and I like to think when I use the word creation that I actually think new creation is more important than old creation. In other words, that what God creates and enacts through Jesus is of greater and more permanent importance than like what's described in the early chapters of Genesis.
mhm,
That in some sense, our current material creation is a foreshadow of the true material creation that is through Jesus, and that our current creation is good. It's not like it's bad, but it has an expiration date. Whereas the new creation that's through Jesus is eternal and is perfect and has no expiration date. So, in a certain sense, when you talk about creation, it's like, well, which creation is more important, the temporary one or the permanent one? And I think it's more natural to think of the permanent creation as the real creation. So, in
mm,
some sense, I could say that Jesus really was the first human being to be fully created,
mm,
and that his the creation status that he has now is a more real version of humankind than even that we are now.
mm,
And so I'm not saying like we don't exist or that we're not real or that we're not humans, but in some sense, we don't have the full real humanity yet. The
mm,
full real humanity was created in and through Jesus, and Jesus, in some sense, is the first human being. In a certain sense, he was, there had been, millions of years of human beings or thousands, however many years of human beings you want to say, that Jesus comes after many human beings.
mm,
But in a certain sense, he's the first real human being. And that this is, I think, part of what's going on at the cross is that the full real human nature is being created in and through Jesus, and that it needed to be created through his suffering, and that was part of like the creation process itself, was Jesus's suffering on the cross, and then in the crucifixion and in the resurrection, kind of like
mm,
simultaneously, the new humanity comes to be. And when we believe in Jesus, we receive Christ in us. In some sense, we die to our old humanity and receive the new humanity of Jesus. And so that's part of what's going on the cross, is the creation of humankind itself, and we receive through grace what, sometimes I say it this way, and I'm not like, this is a little bit crude, I'm not sure if I fully mean this, but I think it's sort of a pithy way of thinking about it, is like what Jesus had to get the hard way, we get the easy way.
mm, mhm,
And because Jesus earned his new creation status through suffering and death, we get it without needing to go through crucifixion ourselves. So it's not like the only way to become a real human being is to be crucified like Jesus was, that we can get it, some sense, through grace and as a free gift through belief in Jesus. So
mm,
that's part of what I think is going on the cross. And I don't think that Trinitarianism has a good way of grappling with that, because it doesn't really think that Jesus could be made perfect, because it would say if Jesus is a full incarnation of the second person of the Trinity, and that there's a perfect full union between the human nature and the divine nature in Jesus hypostatically from the moment of conception, then I don't see how in their theology they could understand Jesus becoming better and better or
Mm,
becoming perfected.
mm,
And that for a biblical Unitarian, it makes perfect sense. And so
mm.
I think that that's part of what they miss about the crucifixion, is that Jesus was made perfect and then we get to receive his perfection.
And that perfection would have a double sense. It would be moral perfection, maybe as exemplified on the cross, but it would also be, I'm assuming, physical perfection in the sense of the resurrected body. And so I guess in that way, I mean, you said like we don't have to endure crucifixion, but at the same time, we have to endure physical suffering, old age, death, sickness, etc. There is a sense in which just normal life is a crucifixion. And I guess
Yes.
the lesson is that Jesus shows the way to deal with this or bear this in a way that actually can perfect us. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think that that is extremely well said. That our own lives can all should be looking like a miniature version of Jesus,
Mm.
and that we will have our own sufferings, our own temptations, our own trials that we're going through, and that we can look to Jesus. And that I would say, I also don't want to fall into the idea that, like, as Christians now we just receive Jesus and like we're all honky dory and that there's nothing for us to do. I think that we can see that in order to have this kind of seed of Jesus that's within us taking over our current selves, that we must act how Jesus acts. And that as we conform ourselves to Jesus, Jesus is more and more of who we are, even now, even before our own resurrections. And maybe that can't be perfected this side of our own resurrection, but it's still something for us to strive after. Is that Jesus is sort of like the human life to its limit case.
Mm.
And that it's like, it's this infinitely maximized archetypal version of what it means to be a human. But all of us will have our own human life in which we can imitate Jesus in the here and now, and that we can be showing the light of Christ in our own lives, as well as becoming conformed more and more and more like him from one degree of glory to another, as Paul puts it, even as we deal with suffering, trials, temptations, problems, persecutions, whatever in the here and now.
I think it's really interesting as you're talking, I'm thinking about Jesus conformed himself to God's will, and Jesus, in that sense, realized God's, let's say, image or I mean, image is a good word, or intentions for him. It's like, and I guess I'm bringing this up because to me that kind of preserves the connection that maybe some people might feel is lost if you let go of Trinitarianism. The sense that we're talking about is not that Jesus invented something on his own or like we talked about before, imposed his will. It's that he withdrew his will and submitted to God to the extent that God's will and intention could just flow through him, essentially.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's what we all need to do. And so there's a continuity in a sense between the divine and the human. There's a sense in which God is active, that Jesus's life is a image of God being active in the world. And it's not just like if you didn't believe in God or you had a deistic view or something like that, you would just see Jesus as being like a really good human from the human side of things. But that's not what you're saying. You're saying that that Jesus was kind of, maybe I'm reading into this too far, but maybe making space for God's will to work within him.
Right. Yeah. Well, what it means to be a really good human is to be like God.
Yes.
And so when you see a human who is being godly, you're also seeing God
Yes.
into the fullest extent that we are able to. And that Jesus is the image of the invisible God to a biblical Unitarian. That the best that we can, that God is inherently invisible to us, but the best that we can do to see God is to see Jesus.
Mm.
Because when Jesus does something, it is God doing that. When
Yes.
Jesus is speaking, it is God speaking.
Yeah.
And that there because of Jesus's perfect submission to God and his perfect cooperation with God, there is a synergy, you could say, between God and Jesus, such that Jesus is God to us in a
Mm,
certain and this is where I feel like the Trinitarians are close. I
yeah.
see kind of where they're going, but I feel like they kind of like shortcut it or ham-fistedly kind of force the issue in terms of Jesus being divine and a revelation of God Himself. And
Mm,
so that's where I am willing to go. Sometimes I really do feel like my Christology is almost higher than their Christology, in that I think that the capacity for the unity between God and Jesus is extremely high.
mm.
And but it's sort of like this spiritual cooperative unity, as opposed to kind of this, Chalcedonian two natures in one person unity, which never really quite seems to make sense or articulate things very well,
Yeah,
I
it's
feel
like
like.
one way of describing it, which is the way you're describing it, is very human and relatable. We can understand what it's like to sort of uh, submit or suspend our own selfish wills and do what is objectively right, or even do what God wills. We can understand that on a very deep level. What it means
Mhm.
for someone to be fully God and fully man at the same time is not something we can readily relate to. It's a kind of,
Yeah.
maybe if I was generous, a koan or something to meditate on, a paradox that might kind of help us to see things in a different way, but it's not easily understood kind of truth or fact. I want to just talk
Yeah.
a little bit about because I think this is really interesting. So this idea that Jesus reveals God to us, the idea that by submitting to God, Jesus enacts God's will in the world, and that would be, I guess, the reason why he's able to effect miracles is because God's will is flowing through him. And I watched your talk with Dr. Andani, is it? Khalil Andani?
Yeah.
And that was
Yes.
a fascinating discussion because especially seeing some of the similarities between Ismaili Islam and Christianity, Unitarian and Trinitarian. Um, but it also made me think of other things too. So there always seems to me to be, when you have a highly transcendent God that can't be mixed with creation. So we're not talking about like the Greek gods or something like that, but some kind of monotheistic God. There always seems to be this need to have some kind of mediator. And so,
Mhm.
like, you get the Imam in Ismaili Islam, but even in Sunni Islam, in the most sort of Salafist, like, don't venerate the saints, don't celebrate the Prophet's birthday. You get this idea that the Quran is co-eternal with God because the Quran is the word
Yeah.
of God. The Quran is God's expression. So it must be, in a sense, part of God. It must be eternal, co-eternal with God. It existed before the beginning of time. And it's like that sounds like some kind of logos or something like that. Like that
Yeah.
sounds very much like some kind of mediator. There's a similar,
Yeah. Even
mm,
even the Quran calls Jesus a word from God.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
and
Um,
I'm like, yes, that's right. Mhm.
and yeah, and like Dr. Andani was saying, the way that Muslims tend to see Muhammad as well, but also even in Judaism, there's this idea that the Torah pre-existed creation as well. It was the blueprint from which God looked into and created the world. Within Kabbalah, you've got the Ten Sephirot, which is sort of emanations. Neoplatonism, you've also got emanations of God. You've got something to bridge this kind of apophatic, inexpressible one with the actual world or universe as it exists. You've got in non-dualistic Hinduism and Advaita Vedanta, you've got and this is a very abstract philosophy. So this is basically the idea that God is completely inexpressible, Brahman is completely inexpressible, the whole universe is God's self-expression and, in a sense, God's self-delusion, or illusion is maybe a less loaded term. But so you would think that's fine, that you can just leave it there. But even they have this idea of avatars, of incarnations of God that specifically come down to teach human beings. You have the idea of just like regular gods that people pray to as being sort of ways to connect with the absolute Brahman. So you would pray to like an image of Shiva or Vishnu. You would meditate on those images, and that would bring you closer to Brahman. They're not worshiping idols, because they don't think that the statues themselves or the gods, even the gods themselves, are the ultimate. They're using them as a connection or a pathway to the one God. So it seems like there always has to be these intermediaries, and that's really fascinating to me. And it seems like they keep coming back. So that's why when I was listening to that talk between you and Dr. Andani, and you were talking about the nature of Jesus as a kind of mediator, as a kind of, sitting at the right hand of God, exalted, kind of representing humanity for us. I was like, that same idea is still there. You can't get away from it. I just want to mention a couple of other things, and I'll want to see what you think about sort of this path that I'm going down. It seems that there's also the state. So this is me trying to understand like the experience of Jesus. There seems to be the state that people can get into through intensive mystical practice or religious practice, where they feel an identity with God. So this happens even in the most monotheistic religions. So I referred to Advaita Vedanta before, non-dualistic Hinduism. You'd think that's obvious that it would happen there. That's true, because the doctrine is that everyone is God. But you also see it in Islam, which is like the ultimate example, maybe, of, God is one, nothing else is God, nothing else can be equated with God. And yet you have Sufis like famously Al-Hallaj, who said, I am truth, I am the truth, which is a name of God. He was essentially executed for this. But you get that actually quite a lot in Sufis, where they get to the state, which I'm going to assume is submission. I'm not going to sort of assume that there's anything else going on. I'm going to assume that they're being genuine in their spiritual practice. They completely submitted to God to the extent that that they only care about God's will. And then they get to the state where there seems to be no distinction between themselves and God. So that seems to be like an experience that people can have. And then finally, there seems to be a way in which the human can converge with the divine. So what I mean with that is sort of like, I guess when we're thinking about miracles, how did Jesus affect his miracles? Well, no Christian is claiming that he just, as a human, just imposed his human will on things, or that he worked some kind of magic. The idea is that he let God's power or spirit work through him, something like that. And so, I don't know what you think about like traditional saints or Catholic saints or things like that, but the Catholic notion is very similar. The miracles that are not that are not happening because of the personal will of the saint. They're happening basically due to the self-effacing of that will by the saint, the fact that God's power can flow through them more. And so if that's true, and it's an if, I'm not like committed to naturalism or physicalism or anything like that. So I'm very open to the possibility that something supernatural can happen when we, have a certain state, a certain psychological state, a certain orientation to the divine. I guess there's these three things that I'm thinking about. There's the fact that in all religions, there seems to be this mediating figure between God and humans, that in at least a lot of religions, there seems to be a state you can get to through submission to God, where you feel like there's an identity or a non-distinction between yourself and God. And finally, it seems like maybe this act of self-sacrificial love or submission can lead to actual miracles happening. So in a way, I don't know if this goes against what you're saying, if it accords with what you're saying, but how do you see some of those things that I've just sort of brought up?
Sure. I think that an interesting way to read the Gospel of John that I think is underappreciated is that Jesus is a human who has had this experience of unity with God
Hmm.
and is trying to teach about that and to, in some sense, share that with his disciples.
Hmm.
And that part of the recurring conflict in the Gospel of John is that Jesus will say these highfalutin things, I am the way, the truth, and the life,
Yes.
or I and the Father are one, or the Father is in me, or I am in the Father, right? These very highfalutin statements. And then his audience, especially the sort of angry Jewish Pharisaical audience, is hearing him say things that are blasphemously self-exalting.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then Jesus will then immediately try and couch this in other language that is self-effacing.
Hmm.
And that this combination, like exactly what I was trying to, that we sort of talked about earlier, this, Jesus is most godlike when he is the least Jesus-like in a
Yes.
certain sense,
Yeah.
or when he completely submits his will to God's will. That is when he is sort of most exalted, is when he's most humble, right?
Hmm.
This sort of and this upside down, unity that he has with God, and that he'll say things, I and the Father are one, and they pick up stones to stone him. And
Hmm.
he's like, well, why are you stoning me? Well, because you are a man, make yourself God. He's like, well, don't, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I'm the Son of God, and the works that I'm doing are not my own. The
Hmm.
works that I'm doing are God's. And if you don't believe what I'm saying, at least believe the works themselves. You can see those, and they're not my works, they're God's works. I can do nothing of my own. I only do what I see my Father saying. I
Hmm.
say nothing of my own. The words that I say are the words that God gave me to say, right? Jesus says that sort of stuff all over the Gospel of John, that he can't, he has no ability except
Hmm.
what God has given him to be able to do. He has no authority except the authority that God has given him. He doesn't preach his own words, he's preaching God's words. And then he's trying to call in witnesses, like John the Baptist is witnessing to me that this is what's going on. The miracles are witnessing to me that that's what's going on. The truth sort of inherent in what I'm saying is a witness to that's what's going on. And
Hmm.
I'm not just witnessing of myself. So there's this weird balance between Jesus doing this really highfalutin stuff, but also Jesus being really humble and self-effacing at the same time,
Hmm.
and that being the sort of parallel process that's going on. And I think that people still to this day try and misunderstand Jesus in the Gospel of John, is that he's not it's not God himself come down doing all these things. There's a human being who is this conduit of God, of God's words, of God's actions, and that it's exactly able to happen because Jesus is perfectly humble and submitted. And so I think that when you think of like an example of, say, a Sufi mystic or a Hindu holy man or something like that, there are parallels to what Jesus says and does. And I'll table the question of sort of Christian exclusivism or Jesus exclusivism, because the Gospel of John is also extremely
Hmm.
exclusivist around the
Hmm.
question of Jesus. But just sort of tabling that question, I do think that those sorts of other examples from those other religions can help you understand what the Gospel of John is really trying to say, that Jesus is a human being who has had some sort of mystical experience. There's that passage early on in the Gospel of John where Jesus says to Nicodemus, no one has ascended into heaven except he who also descended, the Son
Hmm.
of Man. So in that sentence, Jesus is saying that he has ascended and descended into heaven. And
Hmm.
that was a very common motif in first century Judaism. And in a lot of those, there would be those books written like either, the book of Enoch or the ascension of Abraham or the ascension of Isaiah, where they have some Old Testament figure ascend into heaven, get some sort of revelation while they're in heaven, and
Hmm.
then come back down and share that revelation with the people. That's sort of a very common idea in that time in Judaism. And I think what the Gospel of John is saying is like, look, all those other books that you've read, whether it's Enoch or these other ones, no one has actually ascended into heaven like that. except one person. And it's
Mm,
he who also descended, and that's Jesus. That Jesus has some sort of spiritual experience where he ascends into heaven. Maybe it could be his baptism. It doesn't say exactly when it is. And that then he's descending and that he's sharing this. And so he's speaking with God's authority. He's speaking God's words, but he's doing so as a unselfish, humble,
mm,
faithful, dutiful ambassador and son,
mhm,
speaking and doing what God has given him to do. And that he's had this heavenly exalted experience, sort of like a mystic. I think
mhm,
that is a perfectly fair way to explain it. And that's why he's saying things like, I and the Father are one.
mm,
And is that he has had that sort of mystical experience of unity with God that is for him the basis of his authority to do the things that he's doing and to say the things that he's saying. And his audience, especially the antagonistic part of his audience, is interpreting him as being blasphemously self-exalted when
mm.
that's actually the opposite of what he's doing. And that is ultimately the cause that results in his crucifixion,
Yeah.
is that misunderstanding of both the exaltation and the humility trying to hold itself in perfect balance, and that being misinterpreted as something deserving of crucifixion.
And that makes a lot of sense to me, and it makes, I guess, more sense than the strictly Trinitarian interpretation, because you can see, like I've alluded to, other examples of it. Like there have been actual Sufi mystics who have been persecuted or even executed because of these bizarre things they were saying that came out of their mystical experience that seemed to be saying that I individually am God, but which you can also look at as saying, I am nothing, God is everything, and he's working through me. And so it makes it
Mhm.
much more, reading Jesus through that lens makes more sense. And I would, on the topic of exclusivism, maybe there's some sort of scriptural biblical reasons for it, but with putting those aside, it seems like the Unitarian position is more open to it, because it doesn't, if Jesus was fully human, it doesn't need to be the case that other other people from different periods of time, different parts of the world have made spiritual progress to the point where they've started to taste some of the effects of, aligning their will with God, almost to the extent of Jesus. Now, as a Christian, you could still say Jesus was the only one to perfect that. Jesus was the only one to actually achieve that, what you might call unity. But it doesn't seem to me that you need to exclude that other mystics, through submitting to God, which this is always the case, almost always the case, that we're not talking about sorcerers or something. We're talking about people who
Mhm.
practice asceticism and, pray all the time and give up everything, that they were able to achieve a similar kind of perfection. And then what's really interesting to sort of the observer is that they don't always, but they tend to start making curious statements about that seem egotistic, but may be the opposite. Now, there's obviously people that kind of step into that role and play it and exploit people. Like there's more modern kind of people like I guess Osho is a common one that's cited, Adida, these sort of Western gurus that also use that language.
Yeah, cult,
Yeah,
cult leaders. Yeah,
cult leaders,
right.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah,
But I don't think I don't think that proves that there aren't genuine mystics as well from all those other traditions. And I think the key
right.
giveaway would be that these cult leaders, like sexually exploited people, etc., and the genuine mystics lived in a cave for their entire lives. And, so
Mhm. And the ultimate test is, could you crucify one and they wouldn't recant? Right?
exactly, exactly.
Because if they're a selfish cult leader doing it for carnal, selfish reasons,
Mm,
then as soon as you make it too uncomfortable for them, they'll stop.
yep, yep,
But if they're the real, genuine deal, then no amount of torture, crucifixion, or persecution would get them to stop. And that's sort
exactly.
of part of the purpose of the crucifixion of Jesus, is the final and full perfect test of his authenticity.
Exactly, yes, and absolutely. And that's, I think, why it's so luminous to people, is that it really shows the sincerity and the genuineness, or at least let's say sincerity. Genuineness sounds like we've already decided, but I think even for someone who's unsure about Christianity, the sincerity of Jesus is undeniable because it's evidenced by his suffering, and not only his suffering, but if we believe the gospel accounts, his consistent ethic, even on the cross, of forgiving his enemies and like non-resistance and love and so on and so forth. I want to sort of pivot a little bit from what we've been talking about. We've been talking kind of about the connection between the divine and the human, but still, like, there is this distinction, or for a lot of people, there is this distinction between the divine and the human, or the divine and the natural, or let's say the divine and creation. What do you think that distinction is? Like, how would you describe the divine versus the created, or the divine versus the natural?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I still wonder about the right way to articulate this. So I might like start from the end and sort of work my way backwards.
Hmm.
I have my friend Luke Thompson, who is a self described panentheist who
Hmm.
sort of likes non dualism and thinking about Christianity and those sorts of terms, similar to some of those other religions that you already mentioned.
Hmm.
And I tell him, I'm a panentheist, but not yet, and that I think that part of the process for me is that all of creation will get glorified in the way that Jesus has now been glorified. And that this new creation isn't just about the creation of new human beings, although that's a major part of it, but it's the renewal of all creation. Rocks, stones, stars, clouds, animals, etc. Everything goes through this process of transfiguration from the old creation into the new creation. And that human beings are sort of like God's special regents within the creation. But all of creation will go through this, and then God will be all in all. 1 Corinthians 15 talks about sort of now we're in this kind of in-between process where Jesus is submitting all powers and principalities unto himself, and there's sort of like this kind of cosmic political struggle of some kind going on, where in a certain sense Jesus has been given all the power, but not everything is in full submission or cooperation with him, and that we're in this kind of restructuring process where Jesus is getting everything submitted to himself. And then once that process is complete, once all principalities and powers have been submitted unto Jesus, then Jesus hands the kingdom over to God the Father, and Jesus himself is made submitted to God, and then God is now all in all. And that's right there. It's sort of in 1 Corinthians 15, somewhere in the 40s. And that once God is all in all, well, then I'm like, yes, Luke, I will be a panentheist then. Panentheism will be true then. But there's some sort of not yetness to that process where creation is not yet in this perfected state. And that it would be almost sort of a tragedy or a bad thing if creation as it currently is were made to last forever, because there is imperfection, there's sinfulness, there's death, there's decay, there's evil, there's all of these things that would be a tragedy for them to go on forever and ever, an injustice for them to last forever. And so the only sort of creation that could last forever is also the only creation that should last forever. And that would be a perfect creation in which everything is righteous and everything is glorious and everything is in full submission to Christ and submission to God through Christ. And so that must mean that there is some gap between God and creation now that won't exist forever, but exists now. And that there is some sort of ontological chasm. Not chasm, that's too strong of a word. Distinction, I'll say, between our created world in the present and what creation can and should and will look like in the future. And I think that it is, in some sense, sort of what I was talking about earlier, that angelic mediation, where there are these layers that are somehow closer to God than we are, but also can interact with us, that is providing this mediatorial perfection or mediatorial protection between us and perfection that will eventually pass away. And that's sort of like the veil or the scene through the glass darkly. Why God chose to do things this way, I think, like, Jesus's life is like the account of the whole creation in microcosm, so that Jesus's own perfection is sort of like an allegorical condensation of the perfection of all of creation. And then, the same sort of way as Jesus had to mature and through the process of suffering become perfect, all of creation, in some sense, has to mature and go through this process of suffering in order to be made perfect. Now, I'm not a universalist, I'll say. I don't think that that means that every single person will go through this process or single rock and stone that currently is. I think there's sort of this winnowing that happens where some of what exists now is the chaff, and some of what exists now is the kernels of the wheat. And that in this judgment, which is the same thing as God being fully unveiled and having direct interaction with creation, some things pass away, but some things are pure and make it through and go through this transfiguration process. And in the same way, some humans will be raised to share in glorious perfection with Christ, but some humans who don't have Christ in them will be found judged and found wanting, and in my eschatology, destroyed, not like tortured forever in some fiery chamber inside the earth, but just as not all creation can last forever, some things are destroyed and some things survive, and that is sort of the judgment. So I kind of imagine things that way, that there is some sort of gap between creation and God now, but there is still a way for the divine to interact, but it's mediated through various things and it's indirect in various ways. But it will be direct and unmediated in the future. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of my best approximation at the moment.
No, it gets yeah, it definitely I guess I want to just clarify one thing. So there's two ways we can talk about a gap between the divine and, let's say, the non-divine. One is like an ontological gap, and the other is, let's say, a practical gap. That's maybe not a good term, but like so so like there's currently certainly a distance between the divine and the non-divine. Like, it's a struggle to even have a connection with God, let alone have a direct, intimate relationship with God. That would be more of a practical gap. In the perfected creation, would you say that obviously there's no practical gap, but would you say there's still an ontological gap in the sense that there's still a distinction ontologically between the divine and the non-divine? Yes, creation is perfect. Yes, creation is eternal, but creation is still creation. God is still God. Would you uphold that, or would you say that it does disappear?
Yes. I think that it would still probably be proper to talk about, creation and divine, and those words still be meaningful. That to me is very similar to me talking about Jesus and God through Jesus,
Mm,
that I can still say that Jesus is not God, but I can also, in a certain sense, that Jesus is God to us,
yes.
right? In that same sort of way. And I would use the language of participation.
Okay.
That this is the language that the New Testament uses, is that we will become participants in the divine nature. So it's not that we just are God collapsed into non-being or non-distinction.
Mm,
And this is, I think, part of the unique promise of Christianity, is that in some sense we continue to have our individuality and that we continue to have our own particulars and our own distinction, that I'm still me, you're still you, Jesus is still Jesus, and that we have the particularities and individualities that cause that to be a meaningful distinction, but yet we are all together participating in the divine nature.
mm,
And that there is a perfect interpenetration of the divine into creation, but it's still creation. I don't think it's a collapse like, Neoplatonists, like especially Plotinus, often imagined that the end goal of the universe was to collapse into God again.
mm,
And so that it would collapse into, the being beyond being, right?
mm.
The distinction between being and non-being would go away. And it's sort of like, well, is that an annihilation or a divinization? It's sort of
Yes.
like both, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that Christianity imagines that sort of collapse back into the divine, that it's more like there is this effluence out of God that has all of this particularity and multiplicity to it, but it is all still nevertheless divinized and
Mm,
participating in God.
mm.
And that, I think, is more the picture that I imagine and that I feel like Scripture is trying to teach us. It's something more like that.
Creation is good, basically, but with the distinction
Creation is
that
good.
currently it's not perfected, but basically it's good. And that would be the distinction between sort of more Indian philosophies of, life is suffering, life is illusion, the creation is
Mhm.
illusion. Christianity would maintain that plurality and creation and individual being is good. I actually find it interesting that you kind of bring that up because that's something that Trinitarians use a lot when they sort of refer to three persons in one God, showing that there's this diversity and unity. And again, I see a continuity there. I don't see that. I see your position being in perfect continuity with that. Um, from the Unitarian perspective, you could say that they're sort of using metaphysics as metaphor or something like that, that they're expressing the same
Mhm.
intuition that you have about God's relationship to creation, but they've congealed it into a metaphysics or something like that.
Yeah, something. Yeah.
And from their perspective, they would say that you're just on your pathway to their Trinitarian realization or something like that. But
Yeah, they've been saying that about me for a while. We'll see if they're right, I guess.
but no, I think that's really interesting. And it's a, like you say, it's a participation. It's not there is maybe ultimately a distinction in the sense that you would also say there's ultimately a distinction between Jesus and God, even divinized Jesus and God, or let's say exalted Jesus and God. And
Mhm.
yet there's a complete interpenetration, or there's a complete unity or closeness or participation, something like that. And again, that's something that I feel like is more easily understandable for just a human mind because we can understand participating in things higher than ourselves. We can understand intimate relationships. We can understand feeling close to things, to people. Um, the whole problem of the Trinity, we can't readily understand the whole idea of one substance and three persons. We can't readily understand.
Mhm.
Now, I think it's again, I think it's maybe. I mean, maybe it's true, but I think it's true in a way that we can't understand. And I think Trinitarians would readily agree with that. So then the question is of what exact use is it? I
Yeah.
think in a practical sense, it could be useful as a kind of thing to contemplate, a paradox to contemplate, a koan, a metaphor, something like that. Um, I don't know. Would you agree with that, or would you say even that's going too far?
Yeah, I think that I would certainly say that it's not like we fully understand God.
No.
And I'm certainly not saying that there are no mysteries beyond our understanding. So I'm not ruling that out as a thing that could exist. But sometimes I think that part of the point of the Trinity is almost to be an affront or offensive to human understanding,
Yes.
or a cautionary reminder, like, you can come this far but you cannot go any farther
Yes.
in terms of your mere human reason. And I don't think that that's quite exactly right. I think that we do have, and this is something that basically every time throughout history that Trinitarians and Unitarians argue, we come into an argument on this point, and that Unitarians often tend to have a higher view of human reason than
Mm.
Trinitarians. And we would say something like, the reason that God has given us is God's own reason. It is God's own logos, God's
Mhm.
own Sophia. And that I feel like my theology says that there won't be a contradiction or a impossible understanding within God. It's just this infinitely deep well that we can keep growing into,
Mhm.
and that there is no, stop here, you can go no further sort of thing, because once upon one day in the future we will know God just as we are fully known.
Mm.
And that there is this invitation to deeper exploration without a stop here sign. and that we can remind ourselves of our own, limitations and God's fundamental unknowingness in the here and now. That's all well and good, and I'm not saying otherwise. But I feel like my theology is like something that makes sense, that is not like, oh, I finally have explained God. There's no reason to try and understand anything more. I've got the final full package here.
Hmm.
That's not what I'm saying, but it's like a understandable, non-contradictory, theology that is this thing that invites infinite moreness. And
Mm.
I feel like the Trinitarian idea is that there is some kind of constraint on that infinite moreness that humans don't get to. And that's something that I would disagree with, I think, if that makes sense.
That infinite moreness, that reminds me of something that came up in your talk with Dr. Andani, which was his view of, I guess, a more, did he describe it as classical theism, but more of a transcendent view of God, the idea that God transcends personality, not the sense that God is impersonal below personality, but that God includes and transcends personality. And at the time,
Mhm.
at least, you held to a more personalist view of God. Would you still have that position, or do you think that there's sort of depths to God beyond our beyond personality?
Yeah. I think I have more sympathy and more understanding. Dr. Andani is very Neoplatonic in his understanding of God, and has this sort of, God the one that's above the logos, or above, I forget what the Arabic word that he uses is, but basically the logos from a Christian point of view. And that God transcends sort of even verbalization or categorization or description itself. And I think I understand that point more than I did at the time. I like that time I talked to Andani, that might have been 3.5, 4 years ago or something like that.
Mm.
Um, and I guess I don't know. I still kind of feel like I don't I sometimes hesitate at models of divine simplicity or Neoplatonic understandings of God's absolute transcendence that sort of make God just feel so abstract and impersonal
Mm.
that it seems out of joint with my own experience of a loving and interpersonal relationship that I have with God.
Mm.
Um, and maybe there's some way of reconciling those two things more than I have, but I still feel, personally loved by God
Mm.
in a way that I just haven't felt the emotional warmth from
Mm.
when thinking about those sort of more Neoplatonic or highly divinely simple ways of conceiving of God. And
Mm.
maybe I'm just not doing it right, but I still feel a little bit like I want to lean in a more personalist direction than those models tend to.
Yeah, yeah, I can see where you're coming from there, because I mean, God is something that I like to think about a lot, but struggle to have a felt relationship with. But the value of that felt relationship, to the extent that it does exist, is far outweighs the speculation. And I think part of it is also sort of a moral point, like speculating about God without the feeling of God's reality and reverence for God and love for God is essentially an egoistic activity. And so I think there's that as well. So for more abstract notions of God, the more transcendent you get, I think the more risky it is, um, because you don't have that sort of felt sense of holiness or submission. Um, that's sort of just my intuition on that, and that's sort of how I try to orient myself. But at the same time, it could also be true. Like, it could also be true that God is transcendent, and that it's purely for our benefit that he manifests in these ways where we feel him as a personal presence and so forth. So I'm also open to that. But I think that in terms of drawing nearer to God in a practical sense, the more personal, let's say, images or ways of relating are more helpful, let's say.
Yeah. And another thing that I think about on this subject is how exactly would it be the case that Jesus is such a good image of God as a loving human person if that weren't an accurate revelation and depiction of God himself? And it seems to me like if you make God too abstract and too exalted above the logos, then it doesn't seem like Jesus is a very perfect revelation of that thing that's beyond. And it's funny, I'm going to do something that's very weird. I'm going to agree with Athanasius against Arius. So part of the Arian controversy, and this is something that if like the conversation that we just had over the last, let's say the last half hour of what we were talking about will really help understand the Arian controversy. People just do not understand what the Arian controversy actually was. And that Arius was a very Neoplatonic Christian who had an extremely stark divide between God the One and the Logos, and did the very apophatic thing of, the One is utterly beyond description. The Logos is good, and that everything underneath the Logos is, kind of permeated by the Logos. But we have to remember that Logos has division within it and has distinction within it, and God the One must be beyond distinction and division and categorization. So the Logos is like the best that we can get at understanding God, but we always have to remember apophatically that God is above and beyond all that. And that was part of his, I assume, Arius's own contemplative practice, was meditating sort of on that kind of apophatic vision of God, and sort of trying to transcend category and stuff like that. And that's one of the main reasons why he had such a stark distinction between God and Jesus, and kept insisting that they had different essences and that they weren't of the same substance and stuff like that, is preserving that kind of apophatic jump that happens when you get above the Logos. And Athanasius was like, oh, no, that doesn't make sense. How could he be an image of the invisible God unless he was really communicating something? You're saying that he's a good enough approximation and the best we can get, but that's selling him short on what he is in terms of being the image of God. And that when we contemplate Jesus, we are contemplating God, and we are, getting positive revelation through Jesus, not just negative revelation through Jesus. And I actually think that Athanasius was more right than Arius, which might be the opposite of what people expect me to say. Not that I tend to really greatly admire Athanasius in other respects, but I do tend to lean in that more Athanasian direction, that there must be some real communication of God through Jesus. And if Jesus is this personal being, then he must be in some sense revealing a personal being. And that when we can have emotional closeness and interpersonal relationship with Jesus, we must also be able to have so with God, or it doesn't make sense to me what it would say to say that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. So I do lean in a more cataphatic or positive, I think, direction in terms of being able to think about and understand God through Jesus. And that I think that apophatic direction is too pessimistic and is leaving part of the full revelation of God through Jesus short in some way. So that's something that I've been thinking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, this comes back to just the notion of the mediator. There has to be something to connect us with God in some way or other. And I think for, let's say, Judaism and Islam, it's a book, effectively. There has to be, and God is still personal in those religions, because he's expressing himself through words, through almost conversation with humans. And then, of course, in Christianity, it's a person. But what's been really kind of enlightening for me in sort of watching your videos and hearing you talk is that there is this Unitarian Christian position that fully upholds that, but doesn't conflate Jesus with the divine. That Jesus still is revealing God and still connecting us with God, but we don't have to therefore claim that Jesus is literally divine, or come up with sort of formulas or a kind of metaphysics to explain that. I don't know I'm not Unitarian or Trinitarian, I would say, but I definitely can see more of the Unitarian perspective. And I think for me, as I've kind of emphasized, I think there is a genuine continuity between the two. And so I just have maybe one or two questions to
Sure.
finish on. So this is my sense of it. My sense of it is that both Unitarian and Trinitarian theologies are trying to express the same basic facts. And I think we've talked about some of these, like the fact that Jesus is the Savior, that Jesus is the mediator between God and man, that Jesus is, let's say, the utmost participant in the divine, the utmost that you could participate in the divine as a human, that he is God's beloved Son. Whatever that means, but just the emotional impact of that, what it means to be God's beloved Son. All these things seem to be amenable to interpretation or expression through a Unitarian or Trinitarian theology. And they are all things that, for the most part at least, maybe with some small exceptions, differentiate Christianity from religions like Judaism and Islam, which wouldn't hold this at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so because you've said that I've seen you say somewhere that, you're open to full communion with Trinitarian Christians. So it's not like this, for you at least, is a matter of like heresy or something that would sever communion. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I very much believe that.
So would you agree with that characterization? Do you think that Trinitarian and Unitarian theologies are essentially just different ways to try and express these core facts that make Christianity Christianity?
Yeah, and I would even say I think most Christians get it more or less, or
Mm,
are close enough,
mhm,
and that that there's some sort of kind of maybe common level folk intuitive understanding of these things
mhm,
that I actually think is probably better than the formal doctrine of the Trinity itself.
mhm.
Excuse me. And that's part of the reason why I don't really disagree with them. Sorry, I'm going to take a drink. Is that I think that the disagreement is oftentimes not not at the fundamental level, and it's often at a verbal level.
Mm, mhm,
And then that's why I don't like when I'm in a Bible study with Trinitarians and they don't know that I'm a Unitarian, and I just sort of talk my theology in a way that's natural to me.
mhm,
They're always like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Oh, yeah, well said. That's right. It's only like when these labels come up that they're like, wait a minute, what? You think what? It's like, well, no, you guys have heard my theology this whole time, you
mm,
know, and we seem to agree. And most of the time, with a couple exceptions, when Trinitarians are talking without thinking about the Trinity, like top of mind, I often don't find it very offensive. I often think that they're about right.
mm,
And so I do think that we're trying to make sense of the same thing, and that we do, like every Christian in some sense who reads the Bible regularly gets that Jesus is a person who's trying to live his life righteously in cooperation with God. That
mm,
comes across on every page, and they might have a different way of trying to explain that in the final analysis. But I think that, like, I just am coming back around to I think that most of the disagreement is verbal and
mm,
not substantive. And I will say, maybe perhaps hubristically, that I think my verbalization is better than their verbalization. Um, but I don't think that the disagreement is really bone deep.
mm.
And that I think that after greater dialogue and greater mutual understanding, that the barriers between us will break down and not become more elevated.
And just as a final question, do you see like a trend in that direction or away from that direction, or how do you see things at the moment in terms of the relation between the two?
Eh, I can think of good examples and fruitful examples. I can think of negative examples. And I don't know if I'm optimistic or pessimistic on that front. Um, I think that the more I have a personal relationship with someone, the more optimistic I am. But I also see sort of a rise, especially online, of a kind of, chest thumping
Mm.
orthodoxy
Hmm.
that is increasingly sensitive to questions around the Trinity,
Mm.
because it wants to. Uh, there's always a fear, and I get where this fear is coming from in some respect, that to compromise on orthodoxy will allow Christianity to compromise on other things. Um, and so if we loosen our strictures around the Trinity, then that might cause us to loosen strictures around things that we actually care
Mm.
about.
Hmm.
um, and I think that when Christianity feels embattled, and especially a lot of Christianity is worried about liberalizing tendencies or progressivizing tendencies politically or on sexual questions or on other sorts of things along those lines, that it causes a sense of needing to retreat to the secure citadel of
Mm.
historical orthodoxy. And that often means, really emphasizing creeds and councils from the past that separate Unitarians from Christian or from Trinitarians. And so I see some cause for celebration and some cause for worry. And I'm not sure which feeling is stronger than me. It depends on the day.
Yeah, yeah, I see what you mean. And especially around that fear of that liberalizing tendency. If we compromise on this, then everything will go. What's interesting to notice, though, I think, is that you've got mainline Protestant denominations that never formally compromised, at least to my knowledge, on the doctrine of the Trinity or any fundamental doctrines, but they're effectively completely liberalized and have the
Yes.
same ethics as just mainstream
Yes.
society. And I think the Catholic Church is, in practice, in a lot of places in the West, basically in the same position. So it seems like I think their fears are somewhat misfounded in the sense that
Yeah.
it's not these abstruse doctrines that, once you start compromising on them, then this will happen. It's something else that's going on.
And you can use the Trinity in the opposite direction. You can start progressivizing, but then beat the Trinity to show that you're still Orthodox. And
Mm.
I've seen people do that, right?
Hmm.
Well, like, how can you say that I'm not an Orthodox Christian? I believe in the Trinity and the Nicene Creed,
Hmm.
but I'm going to liberalize over here, 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 and here,
Yeah,
right?
good point.
So, and I like something that's happened in my life before is that people who are liberalizing either publicly or privately will then use me as a scapegoat to show their orthodoxy. Like, I'm willing to excommunicate Sam because of his heresy. So
Yeah,
that's how you can know I'm a trustworthy Orthodox Christian.
yeah,
And that is a way of compensating or proving themselves in the face of something else that they're changing.
yeah.
So it can go both ways. But I'm not saying, I look at Unitarian Universalism and I see, like, okay, point taken.
Yes, yeah.
That is a risk. But like I just said, I can show counter examples that use the Trinity as a shield to progressivize. So yeah, I get it.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Well, I hope the tendency towards sort of mutual understanding and mutual reconciliation can be the predominant one. And hopefully this little discussion contributes to that at least a little bit. I found this really, really fascinating, and so thank you for your time today. Did you have any final concluding thoughts that you wanted to mention?
No, thank you very much for giving me the time, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I had been listening to some other really good interviews that you've had on your channel, and I appreciate your knowledge of sort of world religions and stuff like that, because I do think that is like I enjoy thinking about, like, oh man, these Sufis think about their mystics, or these
Mm,
Ismailis think about their imams in a way that's very similar to Jesus, and that, or the way I think about Jesus, and that helps
mm.
illuminate things. But I don't want to just sound coexisty or something at the same time. But I feel like you kept the balance of that of that sort of topic in a way that I really appreciated, and that I felt like you helped me articulate some of the things, and that this is sort of a side of my beliefs that I don't often get to talk about very often, is
Mm.
thinking about, like, what's the divine human connection and that sort of thing. So I thought you did an excellent job of facilitating this conversation and being a good host. So thanks.
Well, thank you, Sam. Thank you a lot. And yeah, I hope to have more of these kind of conversations as well. And so yeah, May the divine permeate the created. Let's leave it on that note.
Sounds good.
All right.